They listened. Across atolls and anchorages, from jungle ridges and tin-roofed shacks, Japanese signals units filled reels with American voices that rode the Pacific air. The sets popped, the headphones hissed. Operators logged call signs and timestamps, sketched bearings with grease pencils, and passed the spools to analysts who knew how to turn noise into hints. Interception, direction finding, and traffic analysis were daily work for every major power in the Second World War, and the Imperial Japanese Navy and Army were no exception. They caught an astonishing amount of United States radio traffic. They triangulated ships, they tracked air raids, they learned rhythms of supply runs and convoy routes. They were sometimes fast, sometimes lucky, and sometimes devastatingly effective. And yet, there was a stubborn seam they could not open when it mattered. The tactical voice nets carried by United States Marine Corps units that used Navajo code talkers. The phrase, "couldn't crack the Navajo code," is not a slogan. It is a description of a practical failure. The Japanese intercepted plenty. They didn't solve it in time to convert what they heard into battlefield leverage. That gap between collecting and understanding decided outcomes more than the number of antennas on a hill. To see why, you have to start with the real picture of wartime radio. The Pacific was a radio ocean. Long paths at night let signals skip hundreds of miles. Daytime layers bent shortwave like glass. Weather made reception mercurial and cruel. Everyone transmitted because cables did not connect islands and fleets. Everyone worried about being deaf at the decisive minute. So nets blossomed. Strategic command circuits with scheduled encryptions. Naval task force links with prearranged procedures. Army Air Forces channels coordinating strikes. Marine battalion talk for artillery and shore parties. Not all of it was encrypted the same way. Not all of it was disciplined the same way. In that unevenness lived the codebreaker's opportunity. Japanese units learned American habits the hard way. If a convoy kept a lazy calling pattern, bearings converged and submarines waited. If an air group repeated a weather phrase, a cryptanalyst rubbed the phrase like a worry stone until it gave up the key. If a frightened operator spoke too much in plain language, an analyst stitched a narrative from fragments. Interception became a craft of patience. It rewarded volume, repetition, and predictability, three things that tactical ground units tried to deny. Navajo complicated that denial into something more. The Marine Corps program was a voice crypto system powered by living knowledge. It leaned on a language with few non-Navajo speakers in the world, then constrained that language into a compact vocabulary that mapped military terms to agreed words and layered an alphabet system for spelling. It was not magic. It was design. It was procedure. It was training. The result sounded like normal human speech to an eavesdropper, but it carried specialized meanings and drilled patterns that only trained pairs at each end understood at speed. Because it was spoken, it moved as fast as a shout. Because its vocabulary was controlled, it cut ambiguity. Because its speakers were embedded with the units they served, it stayed close to the action, where seconds mattered. The Japanese could intercept the sound. They could record some of it. What they lacked was a tractable path from sound to sense in the minutes when naval gunfire or close air support had to be redirected before the smoke cleared. Breaking a code is always a dance between material and time. If you can hoover up thousands of messages built from a repeatable template, you may find structure. If you can seize documents or capture a trained operator, you may shortcut the search. If you can guess, likely text a unit name, a standard opening your crib might pry the lid off the box. But a small circulation, fast-moving, voice-only system with a non-transparent vocabulary and disciplined users resists all three angles at once. The Japanese were not incompetent. They were outmaneuvered by a system selected for the exact environment it served. The evidence of interception is thick in wartime logs, bearings, call signs, frequencies, mentions of American shore parties chattering in an unknown tongue. Analysts wrote the notes because collection was their job regardless of comprehension. Their problem was prioritization. A finite number of trained linguists and mathematicians sat in rooms with infinite traffic. Strategic systems with long-term payoff soaked up analysis hours. Tactical voice nets that changed with each landing offered fleeting gains unless you could read them instantly. No one has infinite analysts. The clock made choices for them. The impact of Navajo becomes clear when you compare outcomes. On islands where artillery fire and amphibious landings depended on frictionless corrections, frictionless meant someone with a handset calling for an adjustment before the next salvo. Without that timing, naval guns overshot, aircraft lost the thread, and infantry waited. The Japanese heard the bursts of syllables. They could not turn those syllables into coordinates in the window when coordinates mattered most. Weeks later, after-action thought did not move a single pillbox or save a single bunker. War rewards those who can compress sensing, deciding, and acting into a single breath. The code talkers gave that breath to their units. There is a reflex to inflate this into legend, as if the language itself were an enchanted cloak. The truth is less romantic and more impressive. The system worked because the Marine Corps paired a rare language with a carefully curated lexicon and drilled procedures, then pushed the whole package to the tactical edge where timing made it lethal. The Japanese intercepted the package. They could not unwrap it before it exploded. That is the story plain. Not invincibility, not invisibility, suitability. So the opening claim stands: Japan intercepted U.S. radio messages all across the Pacific and did real damage with what it learned. What it could not do was turn the Navajo-coded tactical voice traffic into a battlefield instrument at the rate the battlefield demanded. Collection without comprehension is like a map without a legend. You can admire the shapes. You cannot navigate the jungle. And in the Pacific, the jungle never waited. This story resurfaces because it sits at the intersection of pride, myth, and the internet's hunger for absolute statements. One camp posts lists of Allied code failures and argues that Japanese cryptanalysts carved through everything the United States touched. Another camp insists that Navajo was untouchable, a linguistic fortress no mind could ever breach. Both claims are tempting because they reduce a messy, technical, human process to a slogan. Slogans travel faster than nuance. They also fail at the precise point where the war was won or lost. The clock. The clock is the missing character in most viral posts about wartime signals intelligence. People imagine a code as a locked chest. If any lock can be picked eventually, then any code can be broken. That line contains a quiet error. Eventually is useless in tactical combat. The useful measure is, by the time the next salvo has to land 30 meters left. When a landing craft radios a beachmaster for a course correction under machine gun fire, a perfect solution delivered next week is a perfect irrelevance. The Marine Corps picked Navajo because it shortened the time between seeing and striking. Japanese analysts failed to crack it on time for the same reason: the time was too short. The second reason it trends now is that people underestimate how much interception really happened. You can find ample evidence that Japanese units heard an extraordinary volume of American radio. That fact powers two bad inferences: that hearing equals knowing, and that knowing equals acting. Neither is true by default. Interception is raw input. Someone has to recognize, structure, translate, validate, and route it to a commander who can act in the shrinking window of tactical relevance. At every step, the sand runs down. When your analysts are already tasked with decoding higher-level systems that might reveal convoy routes or carrier movements, you allocate attention to the traffic with the biggest potential payoff. A small, fast voice net, in an unfamiliar language, without abundant cribs, slides down the queue until the fight that generated it is over. The third reason is a misunderstanding of what Navajo actually was. The line, "they used their language," suggests unstructured conversation. In reality, code talkers used an agreed, constrained vocabulary that mapped everyday Navajo words to specific military meanings and an alphabet list to spell the rest. That structure was an anti-structure from an eavesdropper's perspective. It prevented predictable phrases that an outsider could anchor on, while retaining speed and naturalness for the insiders. It looked like fluent talk, It behaved like a cipher optimized for human lungs and battlefield nerves. When you explain that clearly, the mystical language argument dissolves, and the engineering shows through, which is the real source of respect. A fourth driver is the current appetite for hidden history reveals. The louder claim, "Japan actually broke it but burned the proof," has the shape of a thriller. It asks for very little and promises a lot. But history is a spoiled child that demands receipts. If Japanese units had read those nets in time, you would expect to see ripples, preemptive artillery corrections, ambushes keyed to American fire plans, shifts in defensive dispositions that coincided with intercepted calls for support. You would expect to see their own logs and interrogations refer to intelligible content, not just reception. You would expect the US side to record suspicious enemy reactions that hinted at leaks. In the absence of those fingerprints, the exciting hypothesis collapses into a story about the power of suggestion. There is also a sociological reason this story returns. It is one of the rare war stories where indigenous knowledge, modern cryptography, and frontline urgency linked up without leaving a bitter aftertaste of exploitation in the outcome. The Code Talkers' contributions are documented, measurable, and operationally concrete. That makes the narrative emotionally clean in a space where many narratives are not. People want to retell it. As they do, details drift. The internet favors drift. The most useful way to keep the story from tilting into hagiography or cynicism is to hold one idea steady. War is a system of systems operating under deadlines. When a system's purpose is to move information across a battlefield faster than the enemy can stop you, the test is not, could it be broken in principle, but, could it be broken in time? By that test, the Marine program succeeded precisely where Japanese analysts failed. That does not diminish Japanese competence. It highlights the effectiveness of a design matched to its environment. What does this mean for you as a reader or viewer sorting through grand claims? Look for timestamps. Look for who benefited in the moment, not who wrote a memoir explaining it afterwards. When someone tells you a code was unbreakable, translate that to no timely decrypts with measurable battlefield effects. When someone tells you everything was broken, ask them to show you the action that proves it. War speaks in actions. The rest is commentary. Finally, this story trends because it offers a comforting binary in an age allergic to complexity. The reality is more adult and more interesting. Japan's signals units were skilled and hard-working. They intercepted a torrent. They exploited plenty of it. They could not exploit this. The reason sits in procedures, training, vocabulary design, and deployment choices that favored speed and ambiguity for the user and friction for the eavesdropper. That's the kind of truth that stays true even when the algorithm changes, even when the feeds go quiet. You can retell it 100 times without wearing it out. Imagine the chain as 4 verbs in a loop: collect, classify, exploit, feedback. Collection begins with antennas and ears. Japanese Army and Navy listening posts dotted arcs of land and sea across the theater. Operators tuned established frequencies for American naval task forces, transport groups, and ground formations. They filled logs with call signs, signal strengths, times, and rough bearings. When propagation was friendly, distant circuits arrived like voices through a long hallway. When the ionosphere curled away, signals collapsed into mush. The first skill was patience. Classification started the moment a new voice cut in. Was the emission a known net? Did the call sign belong to a ship we had tracked last week? Was the hand on the key the same operator as yesterday? Analysts learned to recognize fists, the subtle pacing quirks in manual transmission, and the cadence of voice operators. A good classifier could tell you that a familiar unit had reappeared hundreds of miles from where it should be, which meant something was moving even before a single word got read. This is traffic analysis in its pure form. You learn from patterns without understanding content. Exploitation is where content mattered. If the target used a vulnerable field code or an out-of-date cipher, and if you had prior crib material weather templates, unit headers, you could sometimes rip messages open. If your prey transmitted in plain language out of laziness or panic, you simply copied. But if the net was transitory, the language unfamiliar, and the messaging style compact and clean, tools dulled. Exploitation thrives on repetition and leakage. Tactical voice nets deny both when discipline holds. The feedback loop made the work military rather than academic. Intercept stations fed summary products to fleet and army staffs. Those staffs judged them against reconnaissance, prisoner statements, and operations. If a bearing triangle suggested an American task force 30 miles west, air patrols swung that way. If message volumes on a certain net spiked at dawn for 3 days running, planners treated dawn as a signature. The loop always ran against a clock. A single triangle that produced a submarine torpedo spread within hours was gold. The same triangle that prompted a memo a week later was a footnote. There were technical constraints that mattered as much as human ones. Recordings of voice traffic were not trivial to produce or catalogue in the field. Even when you had tape, you had to transcribe, tag, and route it. A linguist needed to work that transcription, but linguists were scarce for languages with few global communities of non-native learners. Even when you found a linguist, the tactical value fell as each hour passed. By the time a phrase matched something known, the landing beaches had changed hands again. Against this background, the Marine Corps' use of code talkers exploited every pinch point. Because the system was voice, it piggybacked on radios the units carried anyway, and produced messages at the speed of human speech. Because the vocabulary was constrained and drilled, the sender wasted no words, and the receiver wasted no time deciphering intent. Because the language base was narrow in the global sense, even a disciplined Japanese collection would struggle to assign qualified translators, and any translator without access to the agreed military lexicon would hear ordinary words where specialized meanings lived. The design forced the eavesdropper into a slow lane without ever touching a rotor or a plugboard. Interception. Doctrine tries to claw back speed with cleverness. One tactic is targeted recording. If you know that a particular frequency bursts into life when shore parties begin, you keep a recorder armed to catch that first rush. Another is signal correlation. You watch for coincident spikes across related frequencies that indicate an operation phase change. You might even stage deception, injecting misleading chatter to foul an enemy's rhythms. These methods help. They cannot conjure a plain language crib out of disciplined speech. Without predictable headers, without standard greetings, without the banality that fills most radio time, the analyst loses handholds. It helps to picture a specific moment. A Marine forward observer calls for artillery corrections from a position no wider than a tennis court. He wants 100 yards left, 50 short, then fire for effect. The call goes out in compressed Navajo, mapped words that his partner on the fire net decodes instantly because he drilled that mapping in the back of a truck with the same partner for months. Shells adjust. Machine guns go silent. The observer moves. A Japanese listening post hears syllables, maybe guesses the role of the net from context, and writes a line in a log. By the time that line reaches an analyst with the right background, the skirmish is over, and the net has moved on. At scale, this microdrama repeated from Guadalcanal to Iwo Jima. It wasn't that interception failed. It was that exploitation lagged the fight. Critically, none of this implies that Japanese signals intelligence was weak. On the contrary, where volume, repetition, and crib material existed merchant codes, routine administrative traffic, careless operators, they extracted value. They plotted bearings with competence. They learned to recognize unit habits. They were a professional adversary. The reason they failed here is the same reason any professional fails against a system engineered to starve them of time and structure. This is not a heroic myth. It is an engineering case study with blood on it. The loop collect, classify, exploit, feedback remains the best way to remember how this worked day to day. Put it against the Marine program and you see why the edges never met. Collection succeeded. Classification sometimes succeeded. Exploitation failed on the timeline that mattered. Feedback arrived too late to bend the arc of a single firefight. The Pacific taught that lesson the hard way. The lesson still holds. From a Japanese analyst's desk, the American radio picture looked like a layered city seen through rain. At the skyline were strategic nets, inter-service and inter-theater circuits that moved orders and logistics. These tended to use more formal cryptographic systems, changed keys on schedules, and generated enough volume for pattern hunters to work with. Below that were operational links: task force, coordination, convoy control, air group management. These mixed formality and improvisation depending on the commander and the urgency. At street level lived the tactical voice nets where units fought building to building, beach to ridge. Those nets were fast, dirty, and often localized. In this sprawl, signals discipline varied. Some neighborhoods were lit by steady, readable patterns. Others were shadows that moved and disappeared. The Navy's big circuits, for example, offered a rhythm that any opponent would try to exploit. Even when the content stayed secure, call sign schemes, frequency plans, and traffic volumes betrayed muscle movements. You could know that something large was underway without reading a single line. The Army's theater-level communications revealed similar pulses. For Japan, resource triage pushed attention toward these arteries because they promised insight into convoys, carrier operations, or the timing of major offensives. That attention had opportunity costs. Every analyst immersed in high-level systems was an analyst not staring at the scratchy recording of a battalion net in a language he did not know. Tactical ground communications, by contrast, were a patchwork. Some units, under pressure or through habit, slipped into plain speech more than doctrine allowed. A patient listener could learn objectives or timings, especially when the same phrases recurred day after day. Other units were stricter, using brevity codes and procedures that compressed meaning and blunted analysis. There were also field expedient systems, simple substitution lists or phrase books that worked only as well as their keepers cared to enforce them. In that mess, the Marine Corps program stood out not for being exotic, but for being consistent. Consistency is underrated. It lets a design deliver its promise even when the world shakes. Consider how geography shaped what the Japanese heard. Island campaigns split the air into pockets. High ground favored interception, but jungles and volcanic ridges ate range. Naval gunfire nets blazed when ships approached and went quiet when they withdrew, leaving land battles to local radios that might not skip far. Weather swung the doors open or shut. In some campaigns, Japanese posts could hear the orchestration of an amphibious assault clearly enough to call its beats on a clock. In others, they got fragments, like glimpses through blown-out windows. Across those shifts, one property of the Marine nets kept repeating. They hugged the fights they served and they moved with them. That mobility punished anyone trying to build longitudinal knowledge from yesterday's tape. The communications ecosystem also had a human element that outsiders sometimes miss. Radios are carried by tired people. Procedures live or die on their willingness to use them after 30 hours awake. A program that adds complexity at the edge, no matter how secure, invites failure. A program that adds speed, clarity, and pride in its users, even if its components seem odd on paper, invites success. The Code Talker system did the latter. It turned a small community's knowledge into shared power on the worst days of their lives. Marines who worked with Code Talkers tell you how fast messages moved, how corrections landed before the smoke cleared, how voice carried calm into chaos. Those impressions matter because they mirror what an adversary feels in reverse. A sense that the enemy's coordination snaps like a whip with no crack you can hear beforehand. To a Japanese planner trying to assign scarce resources, the US landscape therefore presented a difficult optimization. Focus on the big nets, because they foreshadowed big moves. Exploit the sloppy units when you find them, because free information is free effect. As for the strange, compact, unfamiliar language on a short-range net that only appears at the height of a landing and then vanishes, record it if you can. Tag it. Hope that a linguist can make something of it later. but do not count on it to save a pillbox today. That hope would be a prayer misdirected. When you thread the whole picture, the verdict is consistent with the outcomes we can measure. Japan faced a U.S. communications environment that was vast, varied, and, at the tactical edge, intentionally hostile to outside comprehension. In that environment, interception was table stakes. Everyone heard everyone. The winners were those who built channels where hearing did not equal understanding on the day it mattered. That is exactly what the Marine Corps achieved when it carried a living language into shouting distance of enemy positions and built a doctrine around it that favored tempo over flourish. The last piece of context is humility. Every side in the war ran successes and failures through its radios. Americans leaked when they were lazy or assumed the enemy was too far to hear. Japanese operators made similar mistakes. No one was perfect. What separates this story is not perfection, but fit. The Code Talker program fit the problem, like a key you cannot copy without the metal it was carved from. Japan reached for it, as any professional would. The teeth never lined up before the door closed. In a war decided as much by minutes as by miles, that was enough. Begin with the voice, because that is where everything starts. A Marine cradles a handset, breath steady, mind already translating intention into a sequence he has drilled for months. He does not speak casual conversation. He does not riff. He reaches for a compact, disciplined vocabulary that maps familiar words to hard military meanings, then stitches the rest with a phonetic alphabet, the way a carpenter runs a practiced hand down a plane. What comes out is Navajo shaped into an instrument, quick, precise, and perfectly suited to the brutality of close combat. To the friendly ear, it is clarity. To the hostile ear, it is speech that sounds ordinary while refusing to give away its inner grammar. This system is easiest to misunderstand if you imagine it as mere language. It was not a unit deciding to chat in Navajo and hoping obscurity would do the rest. It was a formal program built to be reproducible and fast, with a lexicon that assigned specific Navajo words to specific military concepts, artillery, aircraft, directions, units, and a parallel alphabet list to spell names and terms outside the dictionary. The beauty of this approach was twofold. First, it made the message short. A spotter could compress a fire correction into a handful of syllables that his partner on the net would decode instantly because he had the same list in his head. Second, it denied outsiders the footholds that make most cryptanalysis practical at the speed of war. There were no printed codebooks to steal from the pockets of a careless operator. There were no dictionary cribs, no rote opening lines, no predictable punctuation of thought that would let a stranger pin words to meaning in the brief window between call and impact. Inside the units, the discipline was ritual. Trainers hammered consistency because consistency produces speed. Partners worked together long enough to anticipate each other's cadence, shaving away microseconds with the familiarity of a practiced duet. Messages flowed in patterns that felt natural to them, because the vocabulary had been tuned to how Marines actually fought and called for help. You can tell a design is right when it disappears in use, when the tool no longer feels like a separate step, but like an extension of the hand. That is what happened on ridges and beaches where this program lived. From the outside, the same discipline looked like smoke. An eavesdropper would hear sentences with the melody of everyday talk, words that made sense in isolation, and none of the context that would tell him those words had been loaded with second meanings. The absence of cribs was not an accident, it was the point. Standard phrase books create comfort for friend and enemy alike. This lexicon did not. It turned the brain of every trained speaker into a one-time pad of sorts, with the key distributed only to those who shared the training and the radio at the other end. If you test the system against the usual attacks, the strength becomes visible. Seizing material is the classic shortcut, but there was nothing to seize beyond personal notes and the memory of the speaker. Volume analysis helps when messages repeat and routines harden. Here, the routines lived in how Marines fought, not in how they phrased a greeting or began a paragraph. Even a gifted linguist without access to the program's meanings would hear a language that belongs to a people, not to a code. The gulf between those two perceptions is where so many misunderstandings today begin. It is also crucial to say what this was not. It was not a claim that a language alone can make you safe. The language was the foundation, not the fortress. The fortress was built from doctrine. Who gets trained, where they are placed, how they are paired, what nets they serve, when they speak, and how short they keep their transmissions under stress. Every one of those elements pushed tempo forward and pushed outsiders back into delay. In other words, the brilliance lay less in vocabulary lists than in the relentless attention to the real bottlenecks of a shooting war. You can see the effect in the memories of Marines who worked alongside these communicators. They do not talk about exoticism, they talk about speed. They talk about corrections that landed in time to unjam an assault, about aircraft arriving on the right line before a counterattack could gather its feet, about the mild shock of discovering that a message which would have taken a minute to shape and send by other means was gone in seconds, already acting at the far end. That is the measure that matters. War is not solved on chalkboards. It is solved by trimming slivers of time until you move faster than the person trying to stop you. The final misunderstanding is a romantic one, that the success must have flowed from something ineffable, as if mystery itself were a weapon. The truth is more comfortable for serious minds. The program worked because it was engineered for a specific environment and then guarded by pride, practice, and proximity to the fight. It was human, not mystical, concrete, not ethereal. It succeeded because it fit. Fairness demands that you begin with capability. Japanese signals units were not fumbling in the dark. They mapped circuits. They built direction-finding chains that could sketch triangles over blue water and drop pins where carriers might lurk beyond the horizon. They learned to live off routine. Where an American system produced steady traffic with recognizable headers, they squeezed it. Where an operator got lazy, reusing a call sign too long, repeating a weather phrase that never quite changed, they worried at it until the pattern cracked. Interception as an industrial process rewarded patience, and they had that in spades. There were other victories, less glamorous than the legend of catching a fleet but no less real. Administrative circuits leaked habits. Training nets gave away the invisible architecture of commands. Cargo schedules made themselves felt in the swell of messages sent from depots on the eve of a move. All of these piles of hints are what an experienced staff can turn into action when the timing is generous. If you want to know whether an opponent is preparing a push in a week, traffic analysis may whisper the news days before reconnaissance confirms it. That was a craft they practiced with effect. Set against that competence, the failure to solve the Marine voice system can be misread as contradiction when it is really the edge of a map. The skills that break routines do not feed well on nets that refuse to write the same sentence twice. The techniques that thrive on volume struggle when the net is small and bursts to life only at the apex of a landing or a counterattack. The comfortable crutches of captured paperwork and repeatable headers fall away when the code lives inside a person and the format is a breath long. Imagine a room where analysts have been told to prioritize targets with strategic yield. They do not do this out of laziness. They do it because every hour is already purchased by a dozen needs, and some needs promise to reshape the week instead of the minute. In that room, a reel of unfamiliar speech from a short-range net that may not appear again tomorrow will not win a battle for attention unless someone can convert it this afternoon into a map with arrows. That is not a moral failure. It is triage forced by a theatre's size. There is also the harsh physics of distance and air. To reach a receiver, a voice rides layers of atmosphere that sometimes cradle it and sometimes throw it into static. Recordings made under these conditions were often good enough for proof of life and poor enough for fine-grained analysis. The same sentence that a trained partner could decode instantly because he knew the intended meaning could reduce to a smear in an intercept Shaka Ridge away. Multiply that by the fatigue of operators who never sleep enough and the reverberations of a battle that shouts louder than any handset, and the space for miracles shrinks. One more factor sits quietly in the corner: scarcity of the right ears. A linguist who knows the base language still lacks the program's meanings. A linguist who knows neither is doubly blind. The scarcity was not just numerical, It was cultural and institutional. You cannot conjure a trained ear for a language with few outside communities of study in the months between one campaign and the next. Even if you could, you would still need to train that ear on a lexicon that lives inside a Marine's head. By the time you have all of that, the shoreline has changed, and the net you built the training around has already shifted to a new island. All of this explains why success in one arena did not translate to this one. The interceptors were good at identifying patterns where the world gave them patterns. They were good at bending slow rhythms into plans. They were not equipped to rip meaning out of a system engineered to be quick, lean, and private between two trained people at the exact moment when action had to follow immediately. The point is not to paint one side as brilliant saints and the other as inept. The point is to describe limits honestly. Every tool has a purpose. The wrong job breaks even the best tool. If you seek an analogy, think of a safecracker with exquisite sensitivity to tumblers. Put him in front of a lockbox and he earns his legend. Put him on a field where a runner sprints past with a pouch that changes hands before he can touch it, and you will start writing a different story. The skills remain real. The environment refuses to hold still long enough for them to matter. The rooms were not romantic. Tables scarred by years of elbows. Racks of equipment that ran hot enough to make the air taste metallic. Walls plastered with frequency charts and call sign masks that looked like knitted winter scarves from far away. Men bent over headphones with the posture of people listening to a confession they are not allowed to repeat. On good days the waves behaved, and a net would bloom like a sudden chorus. On bad days the noise buried the signal, and the best you could do was write down fragments, hoping the fragments would rhyme with something tomorrow. Everything began with intake. Operators with steady hands and methodical minds filled logs with timestamps, frequencies, bearings, and fleeting identifiers. A good operator knew when to stop chasing a fading voice and when to stand his ground, because the pattern suggested the dance would repeat in a minute. They learned to taste the invisible weather of the sky by ear, to hear when the layers would carry a transmission farther than they had yesterday, and to seize those hours for the nets that only appeared when the theatre moved. None of that was glamorous, and none of it could be skipped. Then came the allocation step that shaped outcomes more than any single instrument. Chiefs stacked priorities with a pencil and a bad conscience. The pencil pointed to the nets that intelligence chiefs ashore wanted summarized by sundown, to the circuits that might betray a convoy's path, to the chatter around a fleet that might shift a map. Everything else stood in line behind those giants. When an unfamiliar voice circuit in a rare language flared on a short-range frequency, it often went onto tape, if tape was free, and into a bin that might get emptied when the night watch had eaten and the big circuits were quiet. You can hear the objection forming. What if that tape held life or death secrets? The objection proves the rule. Secrets are only useful when they arrive before the action ends. A tape heard tomorrow is a story, not a lever. Even when a reel made it to a desk, the mechanics of understanding fought back. Transcription under ideal conditions is hard work. Transcription from noisy field recordings is guesswork that punishes confidence. Listeners learned to doubt what they thought they heard because the ionosphere plays tricks with vowels and the battle plays tricks with syllables. In those conditions, even a linguist with rare skills needs time to build certainty, and time was the one currency that could not be printed in that room. The clock on the wall told them so. It ticked in the accents of ships at sea and men under fire. There were inventions to claw back minutes. Some posts built libraries of operator fists, the subtle swing in timing that made a telegraphist identifiable by ear. Some engineered switchboards that let a single listener skim multiple nets and drop onto the hot one when the tone surged. Some perfected the art of predicting when an enemy net would come alive by watching the rise in adjacent channels. All of it helped at the margins. None of it replaced a trained insider hearing a message designed for him and acting before the echo faded. What did morale look like under such constraints? Oddly durable. People who choose this work tend to enjoy solving puzzles that move. They took pride in the triangles that proved right when a submarine cut a track across a prediction, and a ship exploded where pencil lines crossed. They felt the small, bitter joy of catching an opponent being lazy and turning that laziness into consequence. They knew, too, when a tape was a ghost, when the content on it would never be more than a few lines in a report no one would read because the fight it described had burned itself out before their pencil touched paper. There is a temptation to imagine that a different allocation of effort would have changed the specific problem at hand. Move more ears to the exotic net. Hire more linguists. Buy more tape. The room would have done all of it, if it could. The boundary was not desire, but structure. An army cannot staff every specialized need at the expense of the arteries that keep it alive. A fleet cannot chase every spark when the fire that might consume it will announce itself on a louder circuit. Choices like that are not cowardice. They are the architecture of limits. So when you picture an intercept shack listening to Marines shape a fight with a system built on speed and scarcity, remember the honest texture of the other side of the wire. The listeners did their jobs. They recorded what they could. They sent what mattered most first. And when the curious, compact voices in an unfamiliar language flickered and fell silent, they wrote the time in their book and waited for the next net to bloom. In that gap between hearing and doing, the story you are following took its definitive shape. Trace it across the map, not as a list of dates, but as a pulse that rises and falls with the breath of the war. Early in the island campaigns, when the struggle for footholds defined the horizon, short-range nets bore the burden of turning sight into action at sand level. The first major landings revealed the pattern. Shore parties pushing inland while naval guns threw arcs overhead, aircraft answering urgent calls for suppression, platoons looking for a voice that could move steel faster than enemy repositioning could steal their advantage. In that space, the program first proved its logic. Messages moved without the friction that clogs formal systems. Results arrived before doubt could form. Intercept posts heard the hum but could not resolve it into levers they could pull. As operations matured and the learning on both sides deepened, the same rhythm repeated. On some islands, geography extended the reach of listening stations and gave analysts better tapes to chew on after the fact. You can find traces in logs noting unfamiliar speech on nets associated with artillery or coordination. The recordings exist because collection was thorough. The absence of ripples, no sudden counter-battery miracles keyed to those calls, no synchronized ambushes that mirror the cadence of fire missions asked and answered speaks to what the recordings did not become in time. The nets behaved like lightning. There and gone, the damage visible even if you never see the bolt. During the mid-campaign period, when offense and defense both tried to evolve, improvisation tested every doctrine. American communications discipline faltered in places and tightened in others. The Marine program grew teeth where it had begun as an elegant solution, integrating more tightly with fire control and air support chains that learned to trust its speed. The timeline here is not a parade of slogans, but a series of small pivot points. One landing where naval gunfire corrections arrive in sequence, clean enough to roll a position before reinforcements can string a new line of resistance. Another fight where close air support slips through cloud and over reef because a correction spoken in the right words moves wing and bomb load without a translator's pause. At each point, interception hears the urgency and cannot steal it. Late in the march toward the enemy's inner defenses, the pattern hardens. The defenders are more desperate and in some places better organized for listening. The attackers are more practiced at keeping their speech tight and their nets disciplined. The stakes are higher, the windows narrower. If there were going to be a singular moment when the unfamiliar speech on those tactical nets suddenly yielded a battlefield insight in time to matter, this is where it would show itself. It does not. What you see instead are the familiar signs of a professional but strained intercept apparatus doing what it can. Logging, triangulating, extracting what value it can from the bigger arteries of communication, while the fights that will decide days are shaped by messages that never slow down long enough to be repurposed. After the war, assessments arrive on both sides with the detached voice of engineers adding columns. They describe interception in the aggregate because the aggregate is where budgets live. They note frustrations with voice quality and the scarcity of qualified ears. They acknowledge successes against systems that wanted to be read and failures against systems that did not. When they reach the subject of the Marine program, they tend toward practical judgments rather than poetry. It was hard to exploit on the timescale that mattered. It was well matched to the environment. It did what it was built to do while resisting what the enemy wanted from it. In timelines written with the sober ink of peacetime, that is as close to a medal as a system ever gets. If you want a single lesson to carry out of this sweep, let it be this. The timeline of attempts is really a timeline of timing. Every campaign offered the same challenge dressed in different terrain. Every listening post built its case with the same tools under different weather. The result kept coming back to the same point. Hearing did not equal knowing before the moment to act passed. The system on the beach kept its promises. The system over the hill did too, within its design. Between them stretched the seconds that history counts and memory edits. This account refuses the edit. It leaves the seconds where they were and lets the outcome speak for itself. The story begins with confidence and ends with clocks. In between sit the myths that travel faster than evidence. The most popular claim insists that any language, given enough recordings and clever listeners, will yield its secrets. It feels like common sense because people confuse the solvability of a puzzle in principle with the solvability of that puzzle under fire. A language can be learned, a code can be analyzed, a habit can be profiled, but none of those statements tell you when the learning completes, when the analysis stabilizes, or when the profile becomes actionable. The distance between eventually and in time is the terrain where the Pacific campaigns were actually fought. When Marines used a disciplined spoken system built from a rare language and a trained lexicon, the calendar and the minute hand laid ambushes for anyone trying to catch up. Interception brought in sound. Exploitation kept arriving late. The myth confuses a truth about possibility with a truth about tempo. Another myth swaps magic for engineering. It casts the language itself as an enchanted cloak that rendered messages invisible. The reality is sturdier. The language was the raw material for a deliberate design. Trained speakers used a controlled vocabulary that mapped known words to precise military meanings and paired it with a parallel alphabet for whatever did not fit. The design forced speed for the user and friction for the eavesdropper. It removed printed cribs and standardized openings. It kept transmissions short. It ensured that the only comprehensive book lived in the heads of the people holding the radios, and that those people stood as close as possible to the decisions the messages would change. This is not mysticism, it is logistics. When procedure holds, the outside world sees a human conversation without familiar handholds. When procedure holds at the edge of a landing under shell fire, the outside world does not see it soon enough to do anything useful. There is a myth that the defenders' failure to read the system proves their incompetence. It is tidy and unfair. Japanese intercept and analysis posts were staffed by professionals who did hard work well under harsh constraints. They succeeded in other domains because other domains fed them the kind of food their tools could digest. Long-running circuits, routine headers, volumes that stack into patterns, captured material that gives a first translation. They failed here because the target denied those comforts. A short-range voice net in a rare language that burst awake only during peaks of violence left little to chew. The analysts prioritized other arteries because armies and fleets cannot afford to chase every spark. The myth asks for a cartoon. The record shows capable adversaries running into a system tailored to deny them time. There is a cousin to that myth which imagines that every Allied system was either perfectly sealed or scrubbed open. The truth is dull and therefore powerful. Discipline varied, people grew tired, equipment failed, procedures evolved mid-campaign because the war itself changed shape under the pressure of experience. Where care slipped, enemies listened and learned. Where design absorbed the realities of terrain, weather, and fatigue, enemies listened and learned nothing fast enough to help them. The Code Talker program lived in the latter category because its center of gravity was the moment when a spotter needed to move steel before a defender could reposition. In that moment, the recorder across the valley filled with sound, and crucially, with delay. The physics of minutes decide whether sound becomes intelligence or remains an artifact. Another myth claims that because some phrases in recordings can be glossed after months of post-war study, the system must have been vulnerable in the moment. Post-war glossing is not wartime reading. With time, context, and access to narratives written by the men who used the system, you can match words to deeds and subtleties to outcomes. You can align the music with the dance. None of that backfills the hour when a battery had to swing left or stop firing to avoid friendly lines. The test is the hour. If you cannot pass the hour, you cannot claim the field. The program's strength was that it pushed almost all of its meaning into the hour and left very little for any other time. The recordings that live in archives prove collection. The quiet gaps in enemy action prove that collection broke against the reef of timing. Some readers stumble over the phrase unbreakable and imagine that it invites hubris. The safer phrasing is unbreakable on the time scale that mattered. That sentence has the personality of a blueprint instead of a boast. It invites you to measure a system by purpose and context. Could a large, well-resourced peacetime cryptologic institution with native speakers, comprehensive lexicons, paired tapes, and months of uninterrupted analysis reconstruct the mapping of terms? Perhaps. Would that achievement alter a single adjustment sent from a crater during the second day of a landing? It would not. That is the sober standard at which the claims should be read. Unbreakable is a word that can float away. Unbreakable on the timescale that mattered is a weight you can hold in your hand. There is also a persistent myth that the program's success sprang from secrecy alone. In this telling, the scarcity of non-Navajo listeners is the entire explanation. Scarcity mattered, but scarcity without discipline yields only confusion. What made scarcity decisive was how it was paired with training and doctrine. The speakers were drilled. The vocabulary was tuned to action. Transmissions were brief, by design, and by pride. Partners grew into pairs whose shared memory took half the thinking out of decoding. The program did not rely on the enemy's ignorance, it relied on the user's mastery. When mastery meets a clock and the enemy meets a recorder, the outcome is predictable. That predictability is the real, unglamorous heart of the story. Once you sort the myths from the working parts, the outline of reality clarifies. Interception does not equal intelligence unless exploitation rides on its back while the world is still moving. A spoken system that compresses meaning into seconds is hostile to interception's habit of turning mass into insight. A rare language used within a constrained lexicon frustrates the usual footholds that make battlefield reading possible. A program embedded at the tactical edge takes advantage of the one chance war always gives you, the chance to act faster than the other person can reason. These elements do not live in legend. They live in checklists and schedules and people who keep those schedules when their hands shake. Truth is less cinematic than myth, but in this case, truth is stronger. It has the gravity of things that worked where machines and slogans do not. It begins with a sentence that sounds like a confession someone forgot to keep secret. The rumor claims that the defenders cracked the system and burned the files before surrendering. It survives because it grants the dignity of hidden competence to a story of visible failure. The rumor asks you to imagine rooms full of solved transcripts and to forgive the absence of evidence by appealing to the chaos of a collapsing empire. It neglects to explain why the consequences of such reading left no bruises on the fights where it would have mattered. If you can read an opponent's corrections in real time, you do not file them. You ambush the patterns they reveal, and you boast in private memoranda about the skill that made the ambush possible. The timeline contains no such boasts, and the battlefield contains no such ambushes keyed to those strange, compact voices on the air. A subtler rumor offers that the system was a front for a more complex cipher, implying that the language layer was theater to distract from a machine underneath. The appeal lies in making the world tidy. Machines belong to modern war, whereas living knowledge feels too fragile to carry a campaign. The rumor forgets that fragility and speed are not opposites. The machine ciphers did their job at the layers they were built for, where secrecy over days and weeks purchased the time to shift fleets and to conceal factories. On the beach, speed wins. The living design won because it was faster, and because its secrets could not be captured in the way a rotor stack can be lifted from a desk. Every attested use case from the men who depended on those nets is a case of seconds, not a case of theatrical misdirection. Another story says that the enemy spoofed the nets, impersonating voices and patterns to lead fire astray. There were episodes of deception across the theater because war rewards creativity, yet impersonation requires familiarity, and familiarity in this context is not the melody of speech, but the private mapping of words to meanings. Without that mapping, an impersonator has nothing to hold on to beyond noise. If a stranger repeats the syllables of a word that he believes means left when it means cease, the ruse does not produce the effect he wants. The defenders were capable of deception where the grammar of a net was public knowledge. They had no stable grammar here to mimic. The available evidence of friendly forces being led by the nose on those specific nets is absent in the record. The absence argues louder than speculation, because deception leaves prints in the same way reading leaves results. There is a rumor with a different tone that says the program's story was inflated after the fact to secure credit and sentiment. The timing of recognition does not change the physics of the battlefield. Accounts written when men had time to breathe are not less true because they are coherent. The measure remains effect. Units describe messages moving at a tempo that made a difference. Correlation with action supports them. An opponent's logs and post-war surveys describe interception without timely comprehension. Correlation with their lack of action supports that too. Pride, memory, and politics do shape stories. They do not conjure traces of tactical clairvoyance where none exist. Skeptics sometimes ask why, if the program was so decisive, there are not more extravagant claims attached to it in the operations literature. The better question is why a system that solved an obvious wartime problem with an elegant fit would need extravagance. The program stitched a hole in the fabric of communications that more complex machinery could not reach without slowing down. It delivered exactly what its sponsors intended and exactly what its users needed. The literature treats it with the reserved admiration that professionals reserve for tools that do not break under strain. That tone is not suspicious. It is the signature of competence, meeting a requirement. There is also a contemporary rumor cycle, fed by social media, that oscillates between breathless tributes and cynical takedowns. The tributes sell a simple triumph in place of the more interesting engineering. The takedowns sell a shapeless doubt in place of receipts. Neither tone honors the work. The way out of the cycle is to demand what the war demanded. Timelines, chain of cause and effect, and the discipline to reject any claim that cannot be placed on the map and the clock. When you do that, the story stops lurching and stands up straight. The last rumor worth addressing is almost gentle. It suggests that with a few different decisions, more tape machines, more linguists, more attention, the defenders could have turned those recordings into an edge. It is a comforting thought because it promises that resources alone mend every gap. But the bottleneck was not a lack of material. The bottleneck was the window. Even perfect recordings and an ideal distribution of scarce ears would have delivered understanding late unless the listeners could also be co-located with the fights and wired into the command chains the way the users were. Those are not adjustments. They are a different war. The rumor is really a wish that the past could be reconfigured into a puzzle the wishers know how to solve. The war refused that wish and settled for what works. In the end, the shape of doubt around this story is the shape of human nature. People crave hidden mastery and dislike admitting that sometimes an opponent simply outpaces you with a tool that fits the problem too well. Let the craving pass. The room for respect is bigger when you leave it. The men who listened did everything their craft allowed. The men who spoke did what their craft required. Between those two crafts ran a race that the clock judged without passion. The verdict is written in outcomes. It does not need rumors to make it interesting. A system is only as strong as the path that carries its output to the hand that moves a lever. On one side, unit signal officers selected, trained, and paired the people who would carry radios and shape messages under stress. They were not after novelty, they were after reliability. They made choices that look small in print and feel enormous on a ridge. Who stands with the forward observer, who sits with the shore party, who rides with the platoon leader who will ask for steel when a counterattack folds inward. Those choices knit the communicators into the muscle of the unit. They ensured that when someone said a phrase, the person who needed to hear it already knew its measure and would act without consulting a chart. The decision chain was short by design. Short chains save lives in places where long chains get broken by noise, fear, or smoke. Behind those choices sat theater-level directives that balanced freedom with consistency. Standards specified how nets should be opened, how often frequencies rotated, how long transmissions should run before risk outweighed reward, how authentication worked when voices alone had to carry trust. Discipline did not mean rigidity. It meant repeatable speed. The directives left room for leaders on beaches and in jungles to adapt, because any doctrine that cannot bend breaks. But the spine of procedure held. It had to, or the system would decay into the very informality it was built to outpace. Across the lines, signals sections staffed by competent officers and overworked specialists triaged an ocean of traffic and decided who got attention. Their incentives pointed toward the circuits that promised insight over days and weeks. When they succeeded, ships found ships and planes found targets that could not run. You can read the practicality in the shape of their summaries and in the way their energy clustered around nets that repeated. Where repetition lacked, they could still collect. They could not promise timely comprehension. Allocation is the quiet power that governs every complex effort in war. What you point your minds at becomes the thing you are good at. What you leave for tomorrow becomes the thing you explain after the war. This asymmetry created the essential contrast in decision-making speed. The system on the attacking side placed the communicators inside the loop of observation and action. The system on the defending side placed its analysts outside the loop by necessity, because the scale of the theater forced centralization to gain any strategic sense of the whole. Centralization pays when your aim is to move fleets and to gauge supply. It charges a fee when your aim is to catch a whisper and turn it into a response before the dust falls. Both philosophies were right for the goals they pursued. They simply pursued different goals at different timescales. Commanders on the ground learned to trust the voices that came out of those handsets because the voices delivered corrections and support that fit the second hand. Trust is the fuel of short chains. Without it, messages lengthen into explanations, and explanations are the enemy of speed. The trust was earned by repetition in training and reinforced by visible effects when shells landed where they should and when air support threaded the wind at the right moment. The more it worked, the more leaders cut distance out of the loop. That habit is what any adversary hopes to interrupt by reading or faking a net. Here, the adversary had nothing steady to read and nothing accurate to fake at the needed rate. Governance, in practice, is a web of small approvals and non-approvals. Radios get issued. Frequencies get assigned. Schedules get drawn. Those administrative acts look like paperwork. They are the skeleton under the muscle. The reason this story ends the way it does is that the paperwork aligned with the physics. The communicators were placed where they could matter most. The procedures fit the conditions under which they would be used. The oversight made sure that fit did not drift. On the other side, oversight did the responsible thing and kept experts bent over the work that would pay off at the level where empires are protected. Both webs were rational. One was quicker where quickness could decide an hour. You can imagine an alternate blueprint in which the defenders sprinkle more small intercept posts closer to the fights and wire them into local commanders hungry for any hint. In that blueprint, a handful of skilled listeners might shave minutes off the loop between hearing and acting. It is a compelling idea until you price it in personnel, training, equipment, and vulnerability. Small posts die early under bombardment. Skilled listeners are not infinitely available. Wiring them into local commanders risks revealing your listening when the very act of responding gives you away. Absent the mapping between words and meanings, those listeners would still be guessing under fire. The alternate blueprint struggles against the same wall. So when you ask who decided, the honest answer is that many people decided in ways that pushed toward the same result. Leaders chose to put their fastest speakers where seconds mattered. Trainers chose to drill the friction out. Planners chose to keep procedures short. Overseers chose to maintain the shape of the system as pressure bent it. Analysts across the line chose to spend their precious attention where the long game could be influenced. These choices talk to each other across the ocean. They sometimes collide. Here, they passed by, each righteous on its own axis, and each producing the pattern that posters and after-action reports now record without haste. It is an ungainly way to describe victory and failure. It is also how war is actually governed when no one can see the whole board. Strip the decoration away, and what remains is a ledger with two columns, what was heard and what was done. The first column fills easily because microphones are cheaper than comprehension. The second column fills only when a message can move from mouth to action without losing energy to translation or delay. For a season across islands whose names became prayers and curses, the system that mattered most made the second column fat with marks. The men who used it did not talk about elegance. They talked about how fast help moved when they pulled a wire from a pouch and spoke into the weather. The ledger is a way to decenter nostalgia. It keeps your eye on the function. The function was to turn observation into effect faster than an opponent could adjust. That is why the voices earned pride that did not fade when the noise of victory faded. They were not ornaments of heritage placed on parade. They were instruments that refused to be delicate in a world that breaks delicate things. The discipline that kept them from drifting into casual speech is as much part of the story as the language that gave them power. Pride without discipline is a pageant. Discipline without pride is a grind. The program lived between those eras. You can also read the ledger as a practical guide for any system that hopes to remain useful under pressure. First, demand fit. Do not ask an instrument to be more than it needs to be, or to impress audiences it will never meet. The radio circuits that define a war do not care about elegance beyond usefulness. The design here did not chase universal applicability. It chased speed in a very specific context and won. Second, demand placement. Tools kept far from the decisions they influence are toys. The voices became tools because they were carried into the dust where requests and answers happen at the same temperature. Third, demand procedures that protect the intent of the tool under fatigue. Do not trust a plan that breaks when the hands that hold it shake. Across the field, the ledger offers a professional caution that is as relevant now as it was then. Interception is not intelligence. Collection without interpretation on the necessary clock is an archive in the making. Archives make sense afterward. They do not throw ladders across the ditch in front of you. The men who sat with headphones and recorded the music of fights they could not speed up were not wasting their time. They were building the base of knowledge that gives nations a memory longer than a campaign. They were also bound by limits that no amount of effort could erase in the hour when the fight was decided. Respect both truths without blaming them for not being the third thing they could never be. If you leave the ledger and climb back into the human skin of the story, you come to the quietest sentence in the account. Two trained people trusted each other so completely that they could move steel and fire before doubt had time to speak. Inside that trust lived the memory of drills, the muscle of repetition, the stubborn insistence on clarity when panic wants mess. It is a small image next to the panorama of fleets and factories. But sometimes the small image carries more weight because it stands for how complex enterprises actually succeed, by aligning the smallest units so tightly that the whole can turn without tearing. There is a temptation to mythologize models like this until they stop being useful. Resist that path. The lesson is not to hunt for cleverness that no one else can see. The lesson is to match means to ends, to put speed into the parts of your system that face the world's sharp edges, and to guard that speed not with slogans but with structure. The defenders did not fail because they were blind. They failed because they were arranged to look 10 miles wide when the problem was 10 seconds long. The attackers did not succeed because they were charmed. They succeeded because they were arranged to move answers to questions before the questioner stopped speaking. This story also offers reconciliation between two ways of measuring value in war. One way counts ships, planes, factories, and tonnage. Another way counts seconds saved and steps skipped. Both numbers matter. One buys the other time. The system at the center of this account is a monument to time bought at the right scale. It spared seconds. Those seconds paid for meters. Those meters, aggregated across a season of islands, paid for miles. There is no romance in arithmetic, and yet arithmetic is how the romance of survival happens. When you close the ledger, the last line waits for the kind of reader who wants a moral. The moral is that the difference between hearing and knowing is the difference between looking and seeing, and that difference is paid in preparation carried into proximity. People who prefer abstractions will be disappointed. People who have ever tried to do anything hard while the world pushes back will nod. The men who used the voices did not expect applause from history. They expected the shell to land where it should, when a voice said the word that meant left. History's applause feels loud because it arrives long after the fight. It is in fact quiet when measured against the single breath in which those men did their work. The ledger has one more subtle entry. It records the way a community's language became a tool of national survival without ceasing to be a living thing. That is not a small grace. It is an answer to the suspicion that modernity only swallows and never returns. Here, modernity learned to take a step toward human scale. It needed speed and found it in a place that could have been exploited or neglected, and instead was invited to the very edge of the map. The invitation was careful. The return was measurable. The respect that followed was earned. This is not a legend hung on a museum wall. It is a set of choices that worked. The end, then, resists drama because the drama already happened on the days when voices and steel outran doubt. What remains is the clarity you carry forward. Interception without timely meaning is a recording. A recording without consequence is a story. War, like any ruthless teacher, prefers results. The voices gave results. The men who chased those voices across the air did their duty with skill and honor, and met a system that denied them the one ingredient they could not manufacture. You can admire both sides without softening the distinction. The clock did the sorting, the ledger did the counting. The rest is commentary arranged as neatly as memory will allow.